Talking with Jerry.
Okay, so this evening is going to be interesting. It's a hot topic. You're going to hear a lot about it in the coming year. It's another move by conservatives and Republicans and the right to destroy something that was actually created to help African Americans, and that's affirmative action. I'm going to talk about the history of it, why we still need it, and I actually testified to Congress on the importance of affirmative action in the mid 90s. So let's go.
So, Jerry, it seems that every area of African Americans are under attack. Many of the gains that we have worked for, it seems that they're just rolling it back. You know, now they're coming for affirmative action.
Yes.
Why are they doing this? What is the objective? What are their goals? Why are they coming after affirmative action?
Well, many of the programs that were created, as I often mention, to help the common person, the average person, the working person, Republicans and conservative people has always been against. But what they have been more against is anything that they perceive helps African Americans, especially if it comes at the expense of other people. And the problem is that they want it all. There's a pie, let's say it's 100% of the pie, and we have been locked out, whether it is contracts, jobs, opportunity, going to certain colleges. That's why we have HBCUs, historically black colleges, because we couldn't go to other colleges, even if they were in the state that we lived and we paid the taxes for other people to go there. We were prohibited. So the government came along, and it was President Johnson who created this and said, I'm going to create a program to try to eliminate this discrimination in the workplace, in government, and in organizations. And we're going to ask for the government, organizations, and corporations to mandatory as a degree, but we'll trust you that you'll give us reports and try to see that 10% of your contracts or employment and the opportunities that you're given to existing employees, African Americans are given a spot so we can level this playing field out. Unfortunately, they didn't really want to pass this law, so they watered it down and said, all right, it won't just be for blacks or African Americans, it will be for other groups as well. So it could have been for Native Americans. The Hispanic population at the time was very low. The Hispanics at some point, people don't even know, weren't even counted in the census as a separate group. But they also included women in that. Now, it wasn't black women, it was just women. And some of that was good because the colleges that were predominantly male, the colleges and universities, the law schools, if you remember, most of your doctors were all men. And even to get into prestigious universities, they had very few women. So in a way, that was a bargain that was fair. But unfortunately, what has happened is that when it comes to contracts and the like, white males will use their daughter, or they will use their wife or their mother or another family member and list them as the business owner if we're talking about business contracts, and they get the contracts that are part of a set-aside, and these programs were created for African Americans. The problem with education is African Americans were prohibited, as I mentioned, from going to certain universities. So now, when they are going to the Harvards and the Yales, and we know we have great examples of people who have graduated from those schools, and not to say they got in because of affirmative action, but whether you look at the new justice on the Supreme Court, whether you're looking at Michelle Obama, Barack Obama, and so many other great people that went to these Ivy League schools, the people who want to destroy affirmative action are saying, oh, well, they took a seat from somebody else. Well, they took a seat from who? Is it reserved for just all white people? And now they're suing and basing their arguments on, as an example, using Asians to say, well, there are some Asians that did better on test scores than African Americans. So they've used Asians to file these lawsuits. And in the case of a case that's going to the Supreme Court, their argument is, well, some Asians are being denied seats because they did better on the test than some African Americans who applied.
That the argument is basically white and Asian and other groups are being discriminated against because African Americans are getting 10% or less. I mean, the way I see it, 10% or less on the educational opportunities, and what you just explained, even less on contracts and jobs. So is that their argument?
Well, it's a facetious argument, and here's why. When it comes to education, a person who gets a certain test score, that doesn't mean, number one, that they'll finish college. It also does not mean that they will grow into being a successful student to then graduate, complete the course of study, and be a successful lawyer or doctor or business person. Just because you did well on the test does not mean that you're going to have a path, a career path, that's going to lead to success. That's number one. But the bigger argument is they don't point out, and as I pointed out in an editorial, I wrote a counter editorial to someone who was against affirmative action and published an article. What about Jared Kushner, who is President Trump's son-in-law, married to his daughter? Now, when he was getting ready to go to college, he graduated from a high school in Jersey. His high school guidance counselor told him when he came to see her, and he had his papers, he wanted to go to Harvard. She said, wait a minute. You can't go to Harvard. You don't have the grades to get in. Your SAT test scores are terrible. I won't even submit any paperwork for you to go to Harvard because you're not going to get in. And he said, oh, don't worry, I'm going to get in. He didn't go back to see her. He went to his dad. His dad wrote a check for several $1 million to Harvard University. Jared Kushner already comes from a wealthy family. And he got into Harvard. The question is, whose seat did he take? He took somebody's seat. And he took their seat, though he was not qualified. He didn't have the educational qualifications even to apply. Okay? You can look at George W. Bush. Now, of course, we know his father went to the school. His grandfather is a library named after him on the campus. When he was there, he handed in a paper to one of his professors, and the professor, who didn't know who he was, wasn't familiar with the Bush family, said to him, how did you get into Harvard? Okay? We also know that people are given scholarships to go there for badminton, lacrosse, rowing a boat, all types of other extracurricular activities, and they are not that great a student. But no one then comes and says, wait a minute, you're taking away the seat from an Asian or from a white man. No, that's okay. They only want to take something away from African Americans, which was created to level the playing field. And that's wrong. And they're working their way through the courts because the president wouldn't agree with that, the current president. Congress or the Senate wouldn't pass a law to change what is law. But if they challenge it in the Supreme Court, we know that we have people like Clarence Thomas, and we now have a conservative court. They will say it's outlawed. And some universities, just sticking with college admission for a minute, they saw this coming years ago. So example, the University of Texas, what they did was they said, for us to have a diverse student body, we don't want just white males coming here or white males and female students. We want Hispanics and blacks and Asians. We're going to pick a certain number of students from each zip code in the state. And this way, nobody could say that we're discriminating, creating a program to let a certain number of African Americans in or people whose parents come from a challenged financial background. Well, even then, these conservative groups sued. It went to the Supreme Court, but the case that they brought was on behalf of a white female who didn't have the grades. And even in a program created by the University of Texas that would have helped her bring her grades up to then be admitted on the fast track into the school, she didn't do well. So when it got to the Supreme Court, they lost the case. But they keep bringing these cases, and everybody is saying now, because of the court being conservative, that affirmative action coming in probably by the spring in 2023 will end. Now that's the educational piece, but here's the business piece, which is terrible. And I'll give you a great example. African Americans contribute a lot to business and doing business with the United States government. We're also taxpayers. So if we just take the Department of Defense, which has the largest budget of any agency, it's almost half of the money that the federal government takes in every year. This year it'll be over $900 billion. If we look at our last war where we had a lot of casualties, let's say the Vietnam War during the 1960s, African Americans, though we were only 11% of the population, maybe 12% of the US population, were suffering in some months of the war 40, 50, 60% of the deaths and casualties. So if we're taxpayers, and if we're taking one federal agency, which is the largest, the Department of Defense, and we're on the battlefields dying, why can't we get contracts with the Department of Defense? The Department of Defense does everything from buy pencils and papers and of course we're not going to have a factory making missiles or making firearms and rifles, but doing data entry. There's all types of contracts that the Defense Department gives out. So wouldn't it be logical that if even today, with the majority of women in the United States military, the largest group of women are comprised of African Americans, putting their lives on the line for this country. And as African Americans, we're taxpayers. So how could the Defense Department then not want to reciprocate and give us an opportunity with a level playing field to be able to get contracts and participate to do business with our government? And when people attack something like affirmative action on the business side, and this is what I talked to when I testified to Congress about, you have to remember, you have to get the contract, win the bid, and complete it, or you don't get paid. The government is not going to pay you if you don't fulfill the services. So if you have to do data entry, as an example, you must then meet all the checkoffs that you've completed that contract. So it's not about qualifications, because we know in instance over instance, we have been discriminated against, and discrimination exists. And that's why President Johnson created affirmative action.
Yeah, and it's so sad that we're moving, like I said, we're rolling back everything that we worked hard for. That's unfortunate. That's unfortunate because it absolutely does seem like their arguments that they're being discriminated against because of African Americans is a facade, as you stated, to what the objective is.
Mm-hmm.
Completely do away with affirmative action.
Yes, and I want to mention this last argument that they make as well, which is facetious, before I mention something about affirmative action being created by President Johnson. They'll come with all of these stupid, fictitious, random, I don't know where they pull these things out of their behinds. So one of the examples with education, they'll say, well, these universities are saying we have affirmative action because we want to have students come to the school other than just white students. And we want a diverse campus. We want a campus that looks like America. But then they'll say, well, when these black students get there, they associate with each other. And how is it then creating diversity? As if to say, well, see, this affirmative action is terrible because the black kids, they come to these colleges and they hang out with each other. Well, that's ridiculous, because if you're looking at Asians who you're arguing on behalf of, it's a fact that Asians, when they work together in study groups, they study amongst their own. When I taught undergrad, many Jewish students worked together in study groups. And I saw a lot of Jewish females in groups who would, it would be something where they would want to, as women, let me look for my future husband. Who's going to be the next doctor? Who's going to be in the medical school? Who's going to be the next big lawyer? So they weren't associating with other groups as well. Of course, when there's a party or out on campus, people do. But people tend to navigate with their own groups. So whether it's at the lunchroom, or even sometimes just gathering on campus, that's no reason to get rid of affirmative action. And that's another stupid, idiotic argument that they come up with to try to say, this is why we need to end this. And there's no reason in this country, which is diverse as it is at this point, that you have to start with the premise that it's discrimination unless for them the playing field means that all the seats, all the contracts, all the opportunities are only for white males. So President Johnson spoke about this. I just want to break away just to hear some of his comments when he spoke at Howard University about affirmative action, why it was needed, and his words are true to this very day.
Freedom. And the barriers to that freedom are tumbling down. Freedom is the right to share fully and equally in American society, to vote, to hold a job, to enter a public place, to go to school. It is the right to be treated in every part of our national life as a person equal in dignity and promise to all others. But freedom is not enough. You do not wipe away the scars of centuries by saying now, you are free to go where you want and do as you desire and choose the leaders you please. You do not take a person who for years has been hobbled by chains and liberate him, bringing up to the starting line of a race, and then say, you are free to compete with all the others, and still justly believe that you have been completely fair. Thus, it is not enough just to open the gates of opportunity. All our citizens must have the ability to walk through those gates. And this is the next and the more profound stage of the battle for civil rights. We seek not just freedom, but opportunity. We seek not just legal equity, but human ability. Not just equality as a right and a theory, but equality as a fact and equality as a result. For the task is to give 20 million Negroes the same chance as every other American to learn and grow, to work and share in society, to develop their abilities, physical, mental, and spiritual, and to pursue their individual happiness.
America basically is such a diverse country. In the next 20 years, what we look at as the minority, the majority is going to be the majority. It's going to be the majority, and that's just the reality. And numbers absolutely do not lie. So I don't even understand what the argument is. Why are they even in court regarding this when you see where it's moving to?
Well, it's hard to get into the brain of a lot of these people that are funding these groups, putting millions of dollars behind private organizations that are bringing these lawsuits, which they've been doing for years. And I can only say one thing. It's discrimination and it's racism. Anytime African Americans begin to do well or begin to seem to have a fair shake in society, there are some people who don't like that. And they're going to use whatever means they have, which they have the financial resources, to hire the best law firms to go and try to stop that law. And they're not looking at, well, let's see what happens. Oh, we lost, forget it. They will take, just like you saw Roe versus Wade, that was almost a 40 plus year battle to get rid of Roe. And they did it. And this has been a battle, I believe, with affirmative action since the day it was started. They hated the fact that African Americans were going to get jobs in corporations, and corporations had to treat people fairly. They hated the fact that African Americans were not just in the South going to be able to go to historically black colleges, but they had to integrate other colleges and universities. They didn't mind when they needed a football player to run the ball down the field, but they did mind when doctors and lawyers and scientists were starting to be turned out from those same universities, because then they felt, well, that person is taking the seat of a white person. They lost those arguments when they brought them to the Supreme Court before, and now they're saying Asians are being discriminated against, and they're using the premise that is just based on test scores. But here's where I believe it will backfire on them, even if they get rid of affirmative action. Here's where it will backfire. If they merely go on test scores and these types of qualifications, because Asian Americans have a different type of study ethic, have a different type of approach to education as a way of moving forward, and they will take over in many of the universities and colleges the seats in the medical schools, the seats in the engineering schools, the seats in the schools teaching higher sciences. They're not going to go into fields like education and social work and things like that. They will take over those fields, and then the white males are still going to be way on the wayside. Why? Because today, over 60% in some colleges, it's almost 70% of the students are women. And males are only graduating at maybe a 33% rate. And if affirmative action ends, and a lot of these colleges are just doing it based on grades, Asian females will overpopulate those campuses. And it's not going to help white males. So these people who are putting up all this money on behalf of, they look at the white citizenry of America, they're actually creating something that's going to hurt them. And people don't realize that before affirmative action, because I said it did include women, when you watch television, your weathermen, your nightly newscaster, all your field reporters, they were all men. They were basically all white. The reason we have women as newscasters today, we have O'Donnell, the woman.
A great number of your
anchors, right? Yes, right. The everything from the meteorologists to your news reporters, and I was about to name, I think her name is Kelly O'Donnell, does the CBS Nightly News. That would have not happened without affirmative action. The country is better for it. And as you were mentioning just in closing, the future of this country is a country of white people, white men and women, African Americans, African men and women, Hispanics, Hispanic men and women, and Indians, Africans, people coming from Africa and from other parts of the globe. The percentage of students entering not only kindergarten and first grade, but even now in middle school, it's a percentage that's over 55% approaching minority. So the future population within 20 years of this country is going to be majority what you would call minority. So you cannot put impediments in laws to lock them out. And the last thing that I want to mention, what corporation, if minorities, as I've just said, if other groups of over 50-some% of the U.S. population, how can you market your product and say, well, I'm not concerned about half of the country. I only want to market to white people. You'll get fired. The board of directors would fire you. So whether you want to sell Coca-Cola, a soda or pop, or whether you want to sell baby food, or whether you want to get someone to come to your department store to go shopping. You want to reach everybody. And unless you can go to these institutions of higher learning and hire people who have degrees in marketing and management, so when they come to work for your company, they look like half of your customer base. They can explain to you in a marketing meeting, hey, wait a minute, we don't want to run this commercial on TV because it's going to be offensive to Hispanics, or it's going to be offensive to African Americans. You're going to make, as a company, a big mistake. So once again, these actions, they're shooting themselves in the foot. African Americans, we will survive. We will get through it. And I know that there's a lot of colleges and universities preparing for this ruling that will come down. They will come up with something else. They will keep diversity going, as well as businesses, because they know that's right for America. Don't forget to like and subscribe. I hope you enjoyed this discussion. It'll be a big topic come 2023. An excellent addition to this discussion tonight is to watch the film Maynard, on the life of the first Black mayor of Atlanta, Maynard Jackson, and how he used affirmative action to make Atlanta the city it is today. Available on Netflix or through Amazon.